If air conditioner units could sing, what would they sound like? I doubt you've ever thought about that, have you? I mean, why? Why would you? Well, weirdly, the song I'm going to talk about today, Desperados Under the Eaves by Warren Zevon, does offer an answer to that question. So, according to Warren, air conditioner units can sing, or hum, and they sound like this. This humming appears at the beginning of what is probably my favourite coda in all popular music. There's just something about how this whole end section hits emotionally. It's sort of elegiac, but almost heroic. It feels like a triumph over something, but it's not a badass heroism. It's bittersweet, and it's actually maybe kind of pathetic. It's also funny, but without there being an obvious joke. So this video is all about exploring how Warren uses a single line about an air conditioner to kick off the song's coda, elevating Desperados Under the Eaves from a good song to a great song. I was listening to the air conditioner hum. So firstly, the coda itself is obviously nothing without the first half of the song, so let's start from the top. Written by Warren about his alcoholism and his occasional financial issues, Desperados Under the Eaves was released on his debut album in 1976. This song kind of tells the story of how, during a low period in the late 60s when he'd been kicked out of the family home by his wife and was moving from motel to motel in LA, Warren could no longer afford the Tropicana Hotel and had to check into the rather less glamorous Hollywood Hawaiian. Eventually unable to pay his bills even here, he had to make a run for it and got his friend David Marks, a one-time beach boy, to pick him up in the alley behind the hotel. The bill remained unpaid until Warren went back a few years later to apologise. They instead told him that they would settle for an autographed copy of his debut album. Nice one, Warren, very clever. Note to self, stop paying hotel bills, become famous, and in 10 years I can just pay with my autograph. This story isn't actually all that obvious from the song itself, but once you know the background, you can pick out plenty of details. So firstly, he starts the song talking about the Hollywood Hawaiian Hotel, mentioning it by name. His drinking problem is also made clear when he sings about salty margaritas. All the salty margaritas in Los Angeles, I'm gonna drink 'em up. Warren then makes reference to an unpaid bill. Until I pay my bill. And then he obliquely mentions his relationship problems. And I'm trying to find a girl who understands me. And then in the coda, Warren references Gower Avenue, which is presumably meant to be Gower Street, which you'll find in LA and is where many of the original movie studios in Hollywood were located in the early 20th century. Ultimately, the actual specifics of the real life story behind the song aren't the most important thing either way. What's more important is how the first half of the song sets us up for that long coda. So what do these first verses do? Well, they paint a picture of California, specifically Hollywood, Los Angeles, in the late 60s and early 70s, in all its seedy, slightly gross, spectacular, mythic greatness. In many ways, LA is the center of the state's fame, one of the main sources of its stature and cultural impact across the globe. But LA is simultaneously the epitome of the American dream and the grim realization of the American nightmare. With ridiculous wealth sitting alongside brutal poverty, California is a state of sun and wealth, of open progressive politics and values, and also of drug addiction, homelessness, and the endemic exploitation of vulnerable people in the music and film industries. This is the setting of Desperados Under the Eaves, and the first few stanzas set us up both for this wider socio-cultural context and the personal details of Warren's life at the time simultaneously. Drinking problems, marital problems, money problems, living in shady motels famous for accommodating sleazy rock stars and their hedonistic lifestyles. It's a song about Southern California and about Warren's personal problems. And Warren's personal problems are After all, just human problems, unique neither to him nor the inhabitants of Los Angeles generally. So, after these first 4 stanzas of scene setting, we come right back round to the start again. The opening line is repeated verbatim.
I was sitting in the Hollywood Hawaiian Hotel.
Then he mentions the air conditioner.
I was listening to the air conditioner hum.
And then we get that coda.
It went.
When thinking about this song and putting together my ideas for the video, I realized that the most impactful musical element of this song is its form. So it's actually nice to talk about form for once, as I think most videos like this, whether made by me or others, tend to focus on harmony above anything else. I try not to just look at chord progressions, but it's hard to resist given that Western music has historically been so interested in harmony. But form, poor form always gets forgotten. Let's take a close look then at the form of Desperados Under the Eaves and see what's going on. So that brief 2-line stanza at the end of the first half of the song, the bit about the air conditioner hum, is an important moment in Desperados because it's the first time that the song repeats itself. Each previous stanza is different, each with its own unique chord progression, lyrics and melody. Now, because none of it is a massive departure harmonically or tonally from any other verse, that is to say there's no modulation or particularly crazy stuff going on, it all feels broadly similar. It's not immediately obvious, but the structure is actually quite weird. Desperados Under the Eaves certainly isn't a verse, chorus, bridge, or A-B, A-B, C, A-B kind of song. The form is, as far as I can see, A, B, C, D, then we have half of A again, and then we have E. So that is to say, put basically, we have 4 distinct and different verses, after which the first verse is partly repeated with a minor variation in the lyrics. Then we have a 2 and a bit minute coda, which is just the same 4-bar progression over and over again until fade out. Now, we could say that the coda itself is in 2 parts. First, it's the humming, and then a build-up in the second half with the addition of the line, "Look away down Gower Avenue." But I don't think we need to be that specific. The coda is all one thing, I think. The point is that the song is pretty much completely through composed, at least for the first half. In case you didn't know, through composed music is basically just any non-repetitive music. A song, for example, might be considered through composed if it had different music for each verse of lyrics, rather than, say, a strophic song, which would have the same music for each verse. Through composed music is not at all common in pop. Although, while putting this together, I did realize that it's not strictly true to say that the final stanza, the bit about an air conditioning unit, is the absolute first instance of repetition in the song. It's the first proper formal repetition where we revisit, even in truncated form, a previous section. But we've already had "Don't the sun look angry through the trees" in the first line of the 3rd stanza, which gets repeated with slight variation in the final line of the 4th stanza. "Don't the sun look angry at me."
Don't the sun look angry through the trees. Don't the sun look angry at me.
These lines share the same chord progression and melody and most of the same lyrics, but they're only single lines, not enough, in my opinion, to count as formal repetition. So technically, this first half isn't pure through composed, technically. Ultimately though, all this intellectualized formal analysis, whether it's technically or isn't through composed, isn't really the important bit. It's more about how it feels listening to it, and personally, I would say that it is through composed or close enough without ever really feeling like it obviously is. To be honest, I didn't realize until I looked closer at the song. Let's briefly compare it to the most famous through composed song in popular music, Bohemian Rhapsody. This insanely famous Queen song is much more obviously through composed, with radically different parts, different genres even, with modulations, rhythmic and metrical changes, tonal and timbre changes too. Bohemian Rhapsody also wraps up with a reprise of an earlier theme. Just like the first half of Desperados does. But everything else in between is much more obviously formally distinct, with radically different A, B, C, and D sections. So the difference here really comes down to the fact that the harmony in Desperados is pretty straightforward. It doesn't feel like it strays too far from itself. There are no metrical changes and the rhythm is all straightforward 4/4 rock stuff. There are no obvious genre changes in the song unless we count the change from the classical kind of sounding intro to the rock verses. I guess we should count that at least a bit, and there are other slight shifts within the verses, with the song going from being string and piano led in verses 1 and 2 to the slightly more rockin' subsequent verses.
All the salty margaritas in Los Angeles.
Still, it feels much more of a single piece than Bohemian Rhapsody, and I really don't think it would be obvious to most people that this first half is through composed. Hey, you. Yeah, you. If you're enjoying this video, please consider checking out my channel for the other video essays that I've made. I cover loads of stuff from folk music, to prog, to pop, to rock. Also, Beach Boys stuff. Lots of Beach Boys stuff, to be honest. Check it out. I'd massively appreciate a like and a subscribe, and I'd love it if you shared it too. Now, although through composed pop and rock songs are very rare, there are plenty that repeat earlier sections. Everything from Nights in White Satin by the Moody Blues to Walk of Life by Dire Straits, Luca by Suzanne Vega, I Mean Mine by the Beatles, Cat Stevens' Father and Son. These songs all repeat an early verse towards their ends. There are loads of songs, by the way, just loads that do this. Heck, even on this same album, Warren does it on I'll Sleep When I'm Dead to great effect.
So much to do, there's plenty on the farm. I'll sleep when I'm dead.
Broadly, what this repetition does is add a sense of circularity to a song. It makes even a short pop song feel like something of a story that ends where it began. After all, this is a very popular general structure and narrative trope used everywhere in literature, film, television. Like, say, Lord of the Rings. Of course, at the end of it, we have to come back to the Shire. It wouldn't feel completed otherwise, right? Or the 1939 film version of The Wizard of Oz, to take another example. Dorothy wakes up at the end of the film back home in Kansas. And this movie really makes it as obvious as possible by signaling the narrative structure visually. It reverts back to the sepia tone we see at the start of the film after spending most of his runtime while in Oz in Technicolor. Anyway, all those other songs that I mentioned that repeat early stanzas at the end, well, they all follow more orthodox verse and chorus structures. Desperados Under the Eaves and Bohemian Rhapsody, though, they both have those through composed, mostly non-repetitive forms. It's important to also note that circularity isn't just internal to Desperados Under the Eaves, but occurs across Warren's entire debut album, on which this song appears. Desperados is the final track, and it opens with an orchestral arrangement of the piano intro to Frank and Jesse James, the first song on the album. This sort of circularity is very common on classic rock era concept albums. Two incredibly famous examples are Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Pink Floyd's The Wall, where we have framing compositions that bookend each album. This tends to feel to me like a pair of curtain up, curtain down moments. Again, a bit like what we see in The Wizard of Oz. We're brought into the temporary world of the album at the start, and then the reprise closes it off or brings the curtain down, metaphorically speaking. Even without an actual narrative or any real conceptual cohesiveness, it gives an impression of storytelling by setting landmarks for the beginning and the end. The middle bits can just be whatever, and as long as we have those framing bits of music, it all works. After all, Sgt. Pepper's is only just a concept album, really. The opening and closing Sgt. Pepper's tracks are pretty much the only thing that holds it all together. And on that smaller song level scale, Bohemian Rhapsody is pretty much meaningless, let's be honest. Coming back to the beginning at the end makes it feel a bit more sensical or stable, like those disparate parts are actually all connected. What we have then with Warren's debut album is another version of the sort of circularity we see in the track Desperados Under the Eaves. Even if the album is not as conceptual as Pink Floyd's The Wall, there are still some thematic threads throughout it, like immediately preceding Desperados, we have the song Join Me in LA, which is a song about how LA is like evil but irresistible. I'll Sleep When I'm Dead, also on this album, is about burning the figurative candle at both ends. Carmelita is about addiction, gambling, and again, Los Angeles.
The county won't give me no more methadone.
Mama Couldn't Be Persuaded is about an itinerant gambler, his philandering, and his failed attempt at settling down.
What she wanted, and she wanted that gambling man. The parents want.
Elsewhere on this album, he also directly mentions the Tropicana Motel, where he stayed prior to the Hollywood Hawaiian. Anyway, from the piano intro in Frank and Jesse James to the orchestral intro to Desperados, this debut album as a whole has a circularity of form, which makes this not technically a concept album feel much more like one. Loads of albums, after all, share similar lyrical themes without making them concept albums. So I think we're actually going to want a diagram of all this form stuff. Here it is. At least here it is to those of you watching this on YouTube. If you're listening to the podcast version, sorry. This diagram sums up what I've just been talking about, and as you can see, there's circularity across the entire album, opening and closing with the same motif. And then this other instance of circularity within Desperados, the final track, from first stanza to last stanza before the coda. The coda to Desperados then sits outside either of those circles. But what is the point of all of this? Like, what am I getting at? Patience. Patience. We will get there, hopefully. Looking first just at Desperados, ending the song on a repetition of an earlier section, that feels like a natural place to finish, right? That's what Bohemian Rhapsody, the like absolute pinnacle example of through composition in popular music, does. For Bohemian Rhapsody, that repetition at the end, it grounds us and it kind of brings us home. Again, it's like a theatrical conclusion to a Shakespeare comedy, or maybe more appropriately, like waking up only to find out you never left Kansas, actually, and it was
Wake up, honey.
all a dream.
Place like home. There's no place like home.
That is pretty much the best way to end a fantastical rhapsody, I guess. Desperados Under the Eaves is different though. The reprise of an earlier line doesn't come right at the end of the song, but in the middle, at the end of the first half. The coda then steps away from or outside the circularity of the song, as I said before, and it takes us somewhere else via that air conditioner line. Before that happens, however, the repetition of that opening line does bring us back to the beginning again, but this time it hits differently. After all, how could it be the same given everything that the song has taken us through? Sitting in the Hollywood Hawaiian Hotel at the start is just a simple description of fact setting the scene. Sitting in the same hotel after hearing about Warren's alcoholism and a brief glimpse of LA's seedier side, well, it takes on a different meaning altogether. Again, just like Lord of the Rings or The Wizard of Oz. After everything the respective protagonists have gone through, returning home was never going to be exactly the same. This is very explicit in Frodo's reaction to returning to the Shire, and Dorothy also makes it pretty clear that she's done some growing up and learned an important lesson while in Oz. But we still have that following line about the air conditioner, which launches us away from home again into that long coda. Try to just remember this while we look back again to the album as a whole. As I said earlier, the reprise of the piano theme, which we hear at the beginning of Jesse James, and kind of it returns again in orchestral version at the beginning of Desperados, gives it all that pseudo-conceptual feel. As I said earlier, it's more like Sgt. Pepper's than like The Wall, but not just because there's no solid conceptual thread throughout each album, but also the way in which the framing songs work. The Beatles album opens with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the song, and then we get a reprise of that tune towards the end. But, and this is the important part, not actually right at the end. A Day in the Life follows as the final track, and this works as a sort of coda to the album, maybe even like a bonus track of sorts. The two Sgt. Pepper tracks bookend the album, which means that this final track exists outside the world of Sgt. Pepper's Band's performance. Compare this to Warren's debut album and you'll see that they're two versions of the same essential structure. On Warren's self-titled debut, the use of piano and orchestral arrangements of the same theme act as the basic structural bookends on this album, just like the two iterations on the Sgt. Pepper's album of the song of basically the same name. And then the coda of Desperados sits out of that circle entirely, just like A Day in the Life. Rather than simply ending the album then, these formal repetitions create or demarcate sort of, I don't know, inner and outer world across the album. Most of the music fits inside the framing compositions and therefore inside the tenuous conceptual boundaries, but then there's a little bit outside of it too. Now, this isn't an analysis of A Day in the Life, but it's interesting that it too repeats its first verse at the end before going into its own weird coda. It's not exactly, of course, the same structure as Desperados Under the Eaves, but there are plenty of other parallels you could draw. And back again to The Lord of the Rings. All things come back to Lord of the Rings with me. We see the same thing. The Hobbit's return to the Shire isn't actually right at the end. Spoiler alert, in case you need it for Lord of the Rings. They return home, there's the Battle of Bywater, and then that is when we get our happy ending. But it's actually after the happy ending when the books finish, with Frodo, Gandalf and Bilbo leaving the shores of Middle-earth for the Undying Lands. As I said earlier, these sorts of formal and narrative structures are everywhere across loads of media. Right, so here's the thing. Formal descriptions and analyses, like all descriptions and analysis, are in themselves not very useful. Neither is making all these comparisons with fantasy novels or films or whatever. At least it's not useful without an actual endpoint or a sort of theory, I guess, regarding the song. So let me just state my point straightforwardly for once. I think, for me at least, Desperados Under the Eaves, and particularly its coda, essentially offers us an escape from the rest of the album, and therefore an escape from LA. No, I'm not talking about the film. The important thing here is that it's an escape achieved not by turning away from the nitty-gritty, the banal, often a bit grim reality of the place, but by looking at it and focusing on it. You see, All the way through the song, Warren touches on both the ignoble and the noble sides of living, of life, I guess. On the first side, we have the alcoholism, the relationship problems, the money problems, the seediness of LA and Southern California, and therefore of the Titanic film and music industries. These themes can be found throughout the song and throughout the album. But sitting right next to them, we have philosophical musings,
But except in dreams, you're never really free.
religious imagery,
Don't the trees look like crucified me?
mysticism, science, nature,
Like the mystics and statistics say it will.
references to what I can only assume are the tectonic movements of the Earth's crust.
And if California slides into the ocean,
And I can't help but see a sort of dysfunctional, almost narcissistic myopia in these lines in spite of their seeming loftiness. According to Warren here in the song, the mystical and the scientific way of looking at the world both predict that California will slide into the ocean. But this one tacky, inconsequential motel will still stand, so he can pay his probably rather inconsequential bill. Of course, it's not that we're expected to take this seriously or literally, and I'm sure it says just as much about his sense of guilt as anything else, but it's not at all likely. This is the ironic and again, I think, self-aware myopia of an alcoholic here. And no, Warren, the sun isn't angry at you, it's the sun. On a hot day, it looks angry at everyone. Okay, so not literally the sun doesn't look at anyone at all, but the point is that to me, this feels like another instance of that self-pitying narcissism. Or maybe he's just hungover. And we have the Christian imagery of crucified thieves. More guilt, I guess, framed again in pretty hyperbolic terms. Does Warren see himself as a martyr or a criminal? Both? This verse then goes on to the one mentioning the alcohol tremors and the relationship issues, back to the day-to-day banalities of Warren's life then. And back again to lofty ideas. The bit about freedom only existing in dreams comes in here. Then back to the seedy motel and our line about an air conditioner unit. A lot of to and froing then, huh?
Snip, snap, snip, snap, snip, snap.
We have in this song a pretty much equal interest in, on the one hand, the profound and the lofty, and on the other, the mundane and the seedy. This back and forth movement from lofty to debased to profound to banal is interrupted by the most mundane line in the song. It's just a simple bit of description, really. I was listening to the air conditioner hum. Utterly obvious in its mundanity, and yet this is where the song takes off into real profundity, I think. Big pause, cool guitar, drum fill, a choir of humming, and then from that we hear the strings rising in volume a bit later, the backing vocals come in, and then look away down Gower Avenue. Fade, end. It all turns on that weird line. Actually, no, it's not really a weird line at all. There's nothing weird about listening to an air conditioner hum. What is weird is the actual humming that follows it, which retrospectively makes it a weird line, right? I hope you're following it. I'm not sure if I'm following it at some points. Air conditioners all make a noise, but they don't usually hum a discernible melody. Without the air conditioner line, we just have a nice enough, but not particularly impressive melody being hummed through the coda. Without the humming following it, that line is just fine. It works, I guess, but it doesn't do much. But together, well, you need both for the not quite a joke, but you need both for Warren's humour to shine through. The line, followed by the humming, also imbues the coda as a whole with a sort of mindful or meditative feeling. It's almost like, in listening to the air conditioner, he actually starts to hear a melody. The mundane kind of becomes magical. And the way that the strings swell around the 3-minute mark and take over that melody really underscores that effect. I don't know about you, but I feel a real sense of catharsis listening to this song's coda. You can just feel the worries, the problems and the complexities of the earlier verses just wash away in the simplicity of an air conditioner unit humming for you. Right, that is pretty much me. But it's also worth briefly talking about the general arrangement of the song before I wrap up this video. There's a sort of fake or pseudo-classicism all throughout the song, with that orchestral arrangement at the start and throughout the latter half. The choir boy vocals of Cal Wilson also add to it. Now, this is far from the first time that rock musicians have employed string arrangements in their songs. Obviously, we've heard it a million times, and by 1976, such arrangements have kind of become the norm, at least some of the times. They've appeared on the Beatles, Moody Blues tunes, Led Zeppelin, Rainbow. Again, there are just loads of examples everywhere. I think that what's interesting here, though, is that while orchestral or string arrangements within pop or rock songs are often used to elevate or add weight to a composition, and sometimes in attempting to do that, end up accidentally doing the opposite by making the recording schmaltzy or cheesy or a bit pretentious. Here, on Desperados, Under the Eaves, it kind of does both at once, and it kind of feels like that's the whole point. To put it succinctly, this song is all about the highs and the lows of life, of finding the noble in the ignoble and of acknowledging the base in the lofty. I've already discussed how the lyrics do this and the instrumentation does the same. Orchestral arrangements feel like high art, I think it's safe to say, and rock and roll music is certainly low art, if we're to take seriously such dichotomies at all. This song does a little bit of both. Now, I'm not saying these things at all just for the sake of being like gleefully paradoxical. It's just genuinely how I see it. Warren's escape from mundanity and repetition is a descent into or acceptance of mundanity and repetition and repetition and repetition. That air conditioner unit and that simple 4-bar chord progression and melody repeated over and over at the end. It's not just any mundanity or mindless repetition either. It's self-consciously mindful and it's beautiful too. And that circularity within the song and across the entire album, well, we all know the feeling of being stuck in the day-to-day of things and how circular life can feel. I can only imagine that this would be heightened by serious substance abuse. Waking up to the same thing every day whilst having a drug addiction is arguably even worse than just waking up to the same thing every day. We're offered an escape from this. Warren seems to find his escape from both the personal problems and the endemic problems of seedy Californian and LA life by looking at one singular detail, an air conditioner unit. And he focuses all of his and all of our attention on it. It's profound, I think, and it's banal, and it's definitely beautiful in its own weird, messed up, eccentric way. And no, I'm not really sure if I do know what the song title means. It does sound cool though.